Okay, we're going to get started with the second talk. So we have Ellie Grigsby, who is a professor of mathematics and computer science at Boston College. She did her undergraduate work at Harvard, her graduate work at UC Berkeley, and was an NSF postdoc here at Columbia before going to Boston College in 2009. She's been a research fellow at the Isaac Newton Institute for Mathematical Sciences, also deputy director for ICERM, the Institute for Computational Experimental Research in Mathematics. She has a great number of accolades, including the PCASE, the Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers, a Simon Fellowship in Mathematics, the AWM Berman Research Prize, Berman being also a professor here in Barnard, in geometry and topology. For a long time, her research was in low-dimensional topology, but nowadays she's shifted her focus towards mathematical foundations of neural networks, which she'll tell us about today. So, thank you.
Thank you so much for the invitation and the introduction. Okay, so actually, Christoph in his talk mentioned that that AI has sort of had a great impact on very many different academic fields in a short amount of time. I'd say that in mathematics, it's been a little bit slower to actually influence research in the sense that I think that a lot of mathematicians are very, very interested in how to use AI to solve the problems that they already care about. But I've been surprised that mathematicians have been slow to find inspiration in the AI algorithms themselves. I've been kind of continuously surprised about this because there are actually a lot of really interesting mathematics in there. So I'll try to tell you a little bit about some of the mathematics that I've been interested in. Okay, so this is really a talk about optimization and generalization in modern parameterized function classes that are used in AI ML models. And I'll tell you what some of those words mean if you haven't heard them before. Okay, so I'll start by saying a little bit about what mathematicians mean when they are talking about machines learning. So what is a machine doing when it learns? So at heart, what a machine is doing is learning a function from some kind of input space to some kind of output space. And it's learning it by fitting to some finite data set. So you have some data set of input-output pairs, x from x, y from y. It's finite. And what you're doing is, so this is what Christoph called a hypothesis class. You're choosing a particular function class, a big bag of functions that you're looking at this data with respect to. So if you want to learn a function, you need to first restrict your class. And you're now using some kind of optimization algorithm to pick the best function in that class. Okay, so if you've never heard about machine learning, this is somehow the first thing you need to know. But probably everybody in this room knows this already. And also knows that it's a great simplification of what machine learning researchers actually do. There's a lot of subtleties that go into each of these steps. I'm going to try to get at what some of those subtleties are in this talk. But the point is that actually you have this finite data set, but it's actually drawn from a distribution you don't really know. And that finite data set might be good at saying things about this distribution or not. The function class choice is very important. And in fact, that's what a lot of machine learning researchers are doing, are defining new and better function classes for which to do this learning. And the thing that I want to kind of focus on a little bit more is that this optimization algorithm is fundamentally a geometric algorithm. So it's something that mathematicians, in particular geometers, should really be interested in understanding better. Okay, so let me start with one of the subtleties, and it's the subtlety that I'm going to care about most in this talk. So, this is what I described. So, for an AI model, you have this input space where your inputs are drawn from, and you're trying to learn a function to this output space where your labels are drawn from. And you're, sorry, I keep on doing that. And you're using a big bag of functions. And as Christos mentioned in his talk, this big bag of functions is actually a parameterized class of functions, meaning for each function in the class, you have a list of numbers that gives you the address of that function. So this is what's called parameter space. And the point that I really want to make here is that parameter space is not actually a very good model of the function space. So we deal with parameter spaces because we find them easy to understand. But actually the function spaces that we're using, the function spaces themselves, are really just quotients of this parameter space, meaning there can be very, very many parameters that give rise to the same function. And we don't understand the degree to which that's the case in modern classes. In fact, machine learning researchers are creating classes faster than we can understand the function spaces associated to them. Okay, now let me talk a little bit about optimization.
Is the map from parameters to functions all true?
No, I mean, yeah, what function space does it even live in? I mean, it's like continuous functions, piecewise linear functions, definitely not onto, unless you really restrict that codomain. Okay, so the optimization process is a fundamentally geometric process. So what's the idea? Well, if you have a parameter and you have data, you can evaluate how well that parameter does on that data. And the way that this is typically done is by using what's called a loss function or an error function. Depending on the task, the error function will change. But here's some examples for different tasks. And the picture that one should have in mind of what you're doing when you're doing optimization, well, you start somewhere in parameter space. You just randomly initialize at some parameter. And then you step in the direction locally of greatest, being able to reduce your error locally on this data set. And you hopefully get to something that's a global minimum. Of course you don't, because the loss landscape is typically highly non-convex. And in fact, doesn't even look like either one of these pictures. This is greatly simplified. But the point is that it's a very active area of research trying to understand what this empirical loss landscape can look like. So you're trying to get to some kind of critical point, some point where the tangent is flat, so that locally you can't do any better. But we don't actually know what these critical points look like. Okay, so let me address another one of the subtleties. So as I mentioned, your finite data set is drawn from some distribution that you don't know much about besides the finite data sets drawn from it. And so what you're really interested in doing is not exactly fitting the data, but actually doing well on data that your model hasn't seen. This is what's called generalization. And just to give an illustration of what I mean by this, a very simple illustration. Suppose that I have this labeled data set. So we're trying to learn one period of the sine function, but our data is actually noisy. So it's perturbed by some Gaussian around this graph. Okay, so it's not actually, the points aren't actually lying on the function. They're kind of a little bit away from it. And if we try to now fit this data or learn this function, this one period of sine function using polynomial function classes. So a natural measure of the complexity of a polynomial function class is the degree of the polynomial, the max degree of the polynomials that you're using, which also is essentially the same as the number of parameters in this case. You have one more parameter than the degree. But the point is that if you use degree 2 polynomials, well, you're not going to be able to get this kind of curve with the quadratic polynomial. So it's going to do not a great job because it's underfitting the data. Oops, I keep doing that. Sorry. Because it's underfitting the data. If you use degree 15 polynomials, you're probably going to overfit the data. So you're going to do very, very, very well on this finite data set, but you're not going to generalize probably very well to unseen data. And in this case, this sort of, you're sort of trading off this overfitting, underfitting problem. And degree 3 polynomials will probably do pretty well in this case. So this is the sort of classic picture that you see in a lot of machine learning textbooks, that when you're choosing a function class, you actually typically want to choose one that is not too complex, not too many parameters. But actually, these modern parameterized function classes, so at this point, this graphic is actually quite famous among theoretical ML researchers, this so-called double descent phenomenon, that modern parameterized function classes are typically highly over-parameterized, many parameters. So from the point of view of measuring the complexity of the class by the number of parameters, they really should be overfitting the data when they're performing their tasks. But in fact, typically they don't. So the way that you should read this dotted line is the so-called training set. So it's the set of data that the model sees when it's doing its learning. And then this is the performance of a so-called test set. So it's this data that's also drawn from the same distribution, but that the model doesn't see during its learning. And the classical picture is that first you start doing better as your function becomes more, has more capacity, has more complexity, has more parameters. But then the test set starts doing worse because it's overfitting. But what we see for these modern classes is that actually they're highly overparameterized, and the test curve begins to descend again, meaning that the performance on the test set starts to improve again after it initially becomes worse. Okay, here's another empirical. So that was sort of my first empirical mystery that I want to try to get at a little bit in my talk. Here's a second empirical mystery, which I think is really fascinating as well. So this is the so-called grokking phenomenon. And these are models that have been trained on actually some simple mathematical algorithmic tasks, so modular division and product in the permutation group S5. And what we're supposed to be seeing here is that on the training set, you train, all of a sudden you start doing perfectly on your training set. So nearly 100% accuracy on your training set. You keep training. This is, by the way, this is like a logarithmic scale on the optimization. And then all of a sudden, like way after you've essentially memorized your data, all of a sudden you start doing well on your test set for some unknown reason. So this is a really this is really cool. This is really cool. Any questions so far, by the way?
This is particular to the LLMs, right? Like, because if you had done that in your sine plus epsilon.
Yeah, it doesn't work for polynomial classes, and I'm going to try to get at that. But it doesn't just work for transformers. It also works for other modern architectures. Yeah.
Is the data still being the same, like the 50%, or do you keep
So I actually don't know the answer to your question. Yeah, I don't know the answer to this. This is not my work. This is sort of the classical, original grokking phenomenon paper. But yeah, I think it's just a split at the beginning. Yeah, but I don't know the answer to your question. Okay, so the picture that I think has started to emerge, or the sort of conventional wisdom that has started to emerge, is that actually your loss landscape is actually quite interesting. In fact, well, if you are John Morgan, you'll know what I mean. Your empirical loss landscape is not Morse. So meaning you don't have these critical points that are isolated. You actually have large dimensional level sets. But in fact, the level sets aren't even kind of consistently of the same dimension. So you might, this is a graphic I created, not actually a loss landscape for any particular thing, but I'm trying to illustrate this phenomenon that you might have like a two-dimensional critical set along with a one-dimensional spike coming out of it. That this is something that there's no reason why it can't happen. And in fact, I think something like this does happen in practice. Okay, so here's the proposed mantra or guiding belief behind much of what I'll say next, which is that modern parameterized function classes used in AI models are quite inhomogeneous in terms of their complexity. So Christoph mentioned like the VC dimension of a class. This is a complexity measure for the whole class. And what I'm saying is that complexity varies as you move through the class. So it's we should have local measures of complexity, and it's somehow clear that there are. If you look at these empirics, it somehow must be the case that as you move through the class, things are different. And then in answer to your question, Ivan, polynomial classes are not like this. Lower dimensional, lower complexity classes in polynomial classes are measure zero. This is not the case in these modern classes. Okay, so here's the sort of cartoon picture that you shouldn't take too seriously, because this is just a mantra. It's not actually a theorem or even a conjecture. It's just, this is a picture of what I mean, that as you map from parameter space to function space, this map is different as you move through parameter space. It looks different. Okay, any questions before I move on? Okay, yeah.
So when you actually look at multi-layer transformers, you can see this geometry arising where you have these different non-Morse sections and all of that?
So I don't know as much about transformers as I do about feed-forward ReLU networks, but yes, I think the answer is yes. Okay. The other thing that I sort of want to push as a kind of thing that we should be thinking about. So parameterized function classes are really, you should really think of the input space to the parameterized function class as parameter space and input space. And then these are both mapping to output space. And when I talk about the geometry of these classes, I really mean that, that if you fix a parameter, that gives you a decomposition of your input space in a natural way. And if you fix a data set, that gives you a decomposition of your parameter space in a natural way. And that natural way is via whether or not neurons are activated on the various data points. So this is sort of the combinatorics in my title. And this is really sort of the fundamental geometric information when you're describing a function class and how it interacts with data. Okay, so let me actually start by saying something precise. So I'm going to actually focus on a particular set of function classes that I can actually say some things about. And to get started thinking about why this function class is natural, let me really start from the very beginning and motivate why neural networks are natural. So, I mean, this is really ancient history, but I think it's really useful for understanding some of the ideas. So suppose you want to make a yes-no decision based on weighting the answers to a bunch of yes-no questions, which is essentially how we make decisions, if you really think about it. So for example, there's a cheese festival, and I want to decide whether to go, and I answer these 3 questions. Yes or no questions. Okay, so how would we model this? Well, let's say yes is this number 1, no is -1, and we have these n questions, and we input them into this model. We weight the answers to our yes-no questions. We shift based on some internal threshold that we have for outputting yes or no. And then if that weighted sum is above a certain threshold, we go. If it's not, then we don't go. Okay, so this is the so-called perceptron model of decision making. And this is sort of a very, very rudimentary neural network. So the idea is that actually what you're doing is you're computing this weighted sum, and then at the end you're applying what's called an activation function. And in this case, the activation function is just this discrete valued function that can only take the values 1. Well, 0 if you're kind of on the threshold between 0 and 1, or sorry, between yes and no, and -1. Okay, and that's just the sign function, very simple activation function. Okay, and really what this is a linear classifier on your input space. So this is sort of kind of maybe geometrically obvious if you've thought about it, but if not, it's maybe not obvious. But anyway, geometrically, the idea is that this weighting is like taking a dot product, and then the shift tells you how to shift this hyperplane, and it's separating your region according to this hyperplane, or separating your input space according to this hyperplane. Okay, well, a neural network is just the same thing writ large. So the idea is that you have this input space, but now you map, you construct a function class in the following way. You're constructing the class as a composition of maps of a very specific type. Each one of these maps is just an affine linear transformation. So multiply by a matrix and then shift by a vector. So kind of for each of these neurons in these hidden layers, it looks basically like that function that I wrote down before, except the activation function is different. And in my case, I'm going to be interested in this activation function, ReLU. So what it does is if the input to a particular neuron is positive, it keeps it. If it's negative, it just zeroes it out. Okay, so it's actually fairly close to what I described before. So one of the very first theorems in this subject, the study of ReLU neural networks, was due to Arora, Basu, Mianji, and Mukherjee at ICLR in 2018. And what they prove is that if you look at the class of ReLU neural network functions, so where you allow the size and the number of hidden layers to vary, then this is exactly the class of piecewise linear functions from your input space to your output space with finitely many pieces. Okay, so that kind of partially answers some of these two questions that you guys had. Okay, but actually understanding which finite piecewise linear functions you get when you fix an architecture is a quite active area of research among mathematicians, and that community of mathematicians has actually gotten quite large at this point. This is a workshop that happened in Germany in March of this year. Okay, but so I wanted to tell you a little bit. This is not quite the main point of my talk, but I did want to advertise this a little bit because I think it's really interesting. So one line of inquiry that this community has solved that I think is really cool. You might ask, how can the topology of the decision regions and boundaries change according to the depth of a neuron in a ReLU neural network? So I indicate, huh?
Decision region and boundaries?
Yes, yeah, thank you for asking. So, sorry. I'll give an example in a second, and then it'll become clear. So the point is that, right, so if you have a single layer neural network, then the decision boundaries are the hyperplanes. And the decision regions are, you have now, because you have 3 output neurons here, you have 3 different decisions. And then you can record for each region what the answer is in that region. And so these are the decision boundaries, and then the regions are the half spaces that they determine. And the point is that for a single layer neural network, the decision regions and boundaries can't be that interesting topologically. And when I say topologically, if you're a topologist, you know what I mean. If you're not, you should think like number of connected components, are there holes, things like that. Okay? In the single layer case, it's not that interesting. But it actually turns out that for multiple layers, when you pull back the decision boundary to the domain, you have not just these hyperplane arrangements, but these so-called bent hyperplane arrangements. And there shouldn't be a little hole here. This is just me being a bad drawer with my iPad. But the idea is that you still get this sort of linear, these kind of polyhedral regions, but they can look more interesting. And Marissa Masden, who at the time was a graduate student at University of Oregon, I'd say sort of completely solved this problem. It's a really beautiful solution, and it actually has to do with this combinatorics. So the idea is that what you get is a decomposition of your domain for your particular parameter in terms of these hyperplanes and bent hyperplanes. And now you can record not just for the kind of codimension 0 regions, these are all the decision regions, but also for the boundaries, an address in terms of 1s, -1s, and 0s. And these are just the sign that I mentioned before for your ReLU network. And using this information, she actually constructs a cube complex. I'll give you an example in a second. But this cube complex can, for example, detect that this decision boundary here has interesting topology. It's a circle, so it has much more interesting topology than this line. And here is the 4-dimensional cube complex, or a representation of it. I can't draw in 4 dimensions, so I draw 2, 3 cubes. And for this neuron, so it's 4-dimensional because you have 4 neurons, 4 non-input neurons. And for this particular neuron, this is so you see this circle and this other circle. They're connected by an interval. That's homotopy equivalent to a circle. And that actually is representing this circle in the cube complex she constructs. And you can do this for any neuron in the network. She writes down an algorithm, and in fact, she codes it up. So it's really beautiful work.
Can I clarify?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What we should be imagining is you have your 4-dimensional space, you're figuring out where the different outputs. So in this case, I guess there's only one output. So it's like
Yeah, exactly.
one. And then you're trying to say something about the topology
Mm-hmm.
of the space where the output is a 0 or the output.
Exactly. And you can specify, like literally for any neuron in the network, you can specify a subcomplex of this cube complex. And then you can just compute its algebra topological invariance, mod 2 algebra topological invariance.
So I guess in the case that you were describing before with the ReLU network,
Uh-huh.
so there you have this continuous response in
Mm-hmm.
this layer. So is this for the
Yeah.
sign function?
No. These are the decision regions and boundaries for the ReLU network, but using the sign information. So really all you need is the sort of sign information. It's this collection of addresses for your different cells in your complex. And I'm hiding a lot of work. You need your network to be so-called super transversal. You need things to intersect in the expected dimension in order for all of this to work. You need the number of zeros to actually represent the codimension of the cell. So I'm hiding a lot of really beautiful mathematics, but the point is that this is completely algorithmic. Okay. All right, so let me now kind of get to the main point of my talk, which is not really about the data space geometry, but about the parameter space geometry, and how that helps us hopefully understand these empirical mysteries that I described. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about is parameter space symmetries. Okay, so as I mentioned, if you fix an architecture of ReLU neural network, you have a parameter space for that architecture. Basically, it's the number of parameters in these affine linear maps. Here's the count. And this is not the same as the function space for the architecture. So in other words, or what I mean by this is that actually there's a realization map that takes you from a parameter to a function. And as we mentioned, all of these functions are piecewise linear functions. But this map is not injective, meaning it's many to one. There are many parameters that give rise to the same function. And moreover, the degree of that redundancy changes as you change your parameter. Okay, so let me now, okay, and I should also say, when I say symmetry, I mean, there are different things that people mean when they talk about parameter space symmetries. What I mean is just that each function can be represented in many, many different ways. So that's what I mean by a symmetry. And the symmetry is different as you wander through parameter space. Okay, so let me now quickly describe what the well-understood symmetries are for these function classes. And it's all really coming from the fact that you're mapping through these hidden layers. When you describe the function, you're mapping through these hidden layers. But the way that the hidden layer is described is not canonical, meaning each of these is a vector space, but vector spaces can have many, many different bases. And here we're just describing it in terms of one such basis, so one such coordinate system. But there are lots of ways to do it. So let me kind of pull apart the affine linear function and the component-wise activation function in my description of the composed map. And the point is that, so a mathematical way to say what I just said is that you have an action of the general linear group on each of these hidden vector spaces by conjugation. And this is just changing the basis that you're using for the vector space, changing the way that you're describing points in the vector space. And the key observation is that if you have some matrix, so some element of this general linear group that actually commutes with the activation function, well, you can pull this action across to the parameters. The parameters are just these matrices. Affine linear transformations. And so now these matrices are acting on these matrices, and you have an action that you can just see doesn't change the function. And this action works on all of your parameter space. So this is a global symmetry of your parameter space. Okay. And in the case of ReLU, the matrices that commute with the activation function are well understood. They're just coming from permuting neurons in your hidden layers and also these positive scaling symmetries. Okay. So we have these well understood symmetries, and we can already tell here that it's a positive dimensional space of symmetries. So our kind of effective dimension of our model is actually not the parametric dimension. Already, we see that there's this global symmetry group that's acting that has positive dimension.
And on top of that, you have very large dimensional permutation groups.
Yeah. But still, those are discrete symmetries. Those are taking points to points. But it's even worse than that. You also have these positive scaling symmetries that cut down the dimension of your parameter space when you take a quotient. when you identify parameters that give rise to the same function. Okay. We use the term hidden symmetries sometimes. And what I mean when I say hidden symmetry is any symmetry or any redundancy in parameters that isn't this well understood one. And these hidden symmetries are local, meaning that some parameters have more hidden symmetries than others. So the picture that one should have in mind is that locally near a parameter, you have directions that you can move that change the function, and you have directions that you can move that don't change the function. Okay. So as I mentioned, the well-understood symmetries tell us that the expected number of directions that you can move locally to change the value of the function, or to change the function, should really be the parametric dimension minus this expected symmetry dimension. So these are these positive scaling symmetries, which there's one dimension for every hidden neuron. So this is what you might call the expected functional dimension. Okay, and let me now kind of say formally what I mean by functional dimension. So this is work with Catherine Lindsay, Rob Meyerhoff, and Chen-Chi Wu. So where we write this down formally for ReLU neural networks. So the idea is that if you have a data set, you can evaluate a parameter, the function associated to a parameter on each of these data points. And you can look at now you can look at the derivatives with respect to the parameters for these evaluated maps. And you form this Jacobian matrix. And now the rank of this Jacobian matrix should really be, is the dimension of the subspace of tangent space in which gradient descent can move from that parameter on this batch of data. And this is what we call the batch functional dimension. And we should really think of it as the number of directions locally that you can move to change the value of the function on the particular data set. And if we don't want it to depend on the data set, then we take a supremum over all finite batches. Right, okay. I want to point out this is closely related to some ideas that are already in the literature. So I talked about the neuromanifold. You should think of this as being an empirical version of the neuromanifold. So the idea is you're taking some map from parameter space to some function space, and you're kind of approximating that map by instead just picking a batch of data and then looking at a map to RM. And this batch functional dimension is the local dimension of the image of that map. And then also there's the neural tangent kernel. So kernels in general are similarity measures on input space that you should think of as coming from an inner product by taking some map from your input space to some space that has an inner product on it. And in the case of the neural tangent kernel, that space is the tangent space at a parameter. It's not an infinite dimensional Hilbert space. It's just the tangent space at a parameter. And the map is basically taking the gradient. And ours is kind of an empirical version of this. And the batch functional dimension that I described is the rank of this empirical neural tangent kernel. Okay. So here are some experiments about this functional dimension. So these are some experiments we did with, so Catherine Lindsay is my main collaborator, also a professor in the math department at Boston College. David Rolnick is the person who really did these experiments. So what are we looking at here? Well, we're looking at different architectures, different depths, so number of layers, 3, 4, 5, and 6, and different widths. So what we see is that for depth 3, basically at width 15, 80% of our networks, when we compute this functional dimension, had that theoretical max. So only the symmetries that we know of are present for those networks on a particular batch of data. But as you increase the depth, actually what we see is that this spreads out. So at depth 6 and width 15, the fraction of networks that have this theoretical max is below 1%. So we are actually seeing quite a bit of spread, especially for deep networks, of this functional dimension, this batch functional dimension. Okay, so this at least is empirical evidence that this functional dimension is inhomogeneous and is a reasonable measure of local complexity. Any questions about this?
Is there a clear empirically it looks monotone, right?
Yeah.
Is there a theoretical monotonicity of this?
No. Yeah, we still don't have really great complete explanations of this. But at least empirically, it's pretty clear. Okay. What we do have is some theoretical results. So for every architecture, we have like a non-measure zero set of parameter space that doesn't achieve that theoretical max. So it has more local symmetries than the well-known ones. And we also can sometimes guarantee that there's some non-measure zero set that has no hidden symmetries. So for which,
You showed us before with this.
yeah,
Was at initialization.
at initialization.
Have you something similar at the end of the picture?
Yes, I'm going to hopefully show some empirical results for that as well. Yeah. Okay. So let me just quickly say how some hidden symmetries arise. So, the basic idea is that, and it all has to do with neurons in later layers more often being unable to discriminate on your data. So what that means is that a neuron is either active on your whole data set or inactive on your whole data set. And the chances of that happening for later layers actually is greatly increased. And the idea is that the whole image of your map up to that layer will completely miss the hyperplane associated to a neuron in this later layer. And so whether it's on has to do with the direction of this arrow, on or off, in this case off. But the effect, it still increases the number of hidden symmetries or the dimension of hidden symmetries. So if a neuron is stably off, then it's as if your network is smaller. It's as if the neuron doesn't even exist. And if the neuron is stably on, and if you have multiple of those, then you have a larger subgroup of the general linear group that commutes with the activation function. Okay, so this is one of the effects that causes hidden symmetries to arise. I'll now give some experiments done by some students in Robin Walters' lab. So he's in the CS department at Northeastern. These are some really cool experiments that two of his students did. So here are some models that have grokked on this algorithmic task. So this is mod 97 arithmetic. So taking pairs of integers mod 97 and trying to predict their sum. And he looked at a bunch of different architectures, so not just ReLU MLPs, but also transformers, LSTMs, and CNNs. And they all grok. So the dashed lines are the test set accuracy. And this is a measure of the functional dimension. And this is the same scale for optimization. So, and what you see is that the rank is dropping. So this is the batch functional dimension on these batches. So here, these are highly overparameterized models, approximately 400,000 parameters, and a batch size of 7,000, I believe. But the idea is that this functional dimension is tanking right as the model is grokking. So seems to be a pretty good measure of complexity, pretty good measure for generalization. And let me just show one more experiment, one more collection of experiments. So here's so MNIST. So the task is classifying these digits, these handwritten digits. And what Pervik did is added noise to these digits to make the task harder. So this is noise level 0.5, 2, and 5. And what he observed, so he only starts measuring after epoch 1, so that's why, somehow they should all be initializing around the same functional dimension, but immediately and again, these aren't in the same order, which is bad, but for the easier task, which is the lower noise level, you have a smaller functional dimension throughout training. It seems to be dropping during training. He didn't train for very many epochs, but somehow this is really cool as well, that for the harder tasks, you seem to be having higher functional dimension during training. Okay, so anyway, the empirical takeaways are that functional dimension seems to interact with gradient-based optimization in a way that suggests it's tracking function complexity and generalization behavior. It does seem that functional dimension, at least empirically, is inhomogeneous in parameter space for deep ReLU networks. We have some theoretical results, but there's just a lot more to say there that we don't really know yet. And these are really the theoretical questions. Does this geometric measure, this functional dimension, can we prove that functions with lower functional dimension generalize better? And how do we theoretically understand the impact of functional dimension on optimization? Okay, so I'll stop there.
Okay, we have time for questions.
I noticed that often these data sets are modeled on Euclidean space. Could there be any advantages by modeling the data sets on some, say, manifolds or something similar?
Oh, like considering data spaces that are not like Euclidean spaces?
And then maybe use some more tools from geometry to understand.
Yeah. I mean, there are definitely people that are thinking about that. I couldn't tell you exactly who those people are, but yeah, I mean, there's this manifold hypothesis that actually really your data somehow doesn't fill up your whole data space, but is actually sitting on some interesting embedded manifold.
Surface inside.
Yeah, and I think people are really quite interested in the geometry of such a embedded manifold. So yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. I'm also just going to flash references here so people can.
Could you go back to the slide with the grokking, the maybe second to last, third to last?
Yeah, this one.
So I was just I was curious about two things. One, the dotted line for the transformer seems a lot less sharp and has all of these divots in it compared to the others, and I didn't know why that was. And also, these two pictures you have in the middle and the right on numerical rank and effective rank.
Yeah.
Okay, I don't know what that means, but I was just curious what it is and why it doesn't seem to be it seems to be dropping more or less continuously, even though for accuracy we have this grokking phenomenon.
Yeah.
So what is going on there?
Yeah. So, okay, short answer to your questions, I don't really know. I could definitely ask Vedant what's going on here. I don't really know why it's doing all of that. But, okay, so answer to your first, I really don't know if in answer to your first question. In answer to your second question, I don't really know either. But I mean, it does kind of seem that around the time when things start to grok, or like it's really in this intermediate period that things start going down. It's not like a sharp thing right here, I agree, but during this whole period you are going down considerably.
Sorry, what is the numerical rank?
the numerical rank is the rank that I've been talking about.
Okay.
This effective rank is, turns out it's hard to compute the rank of large matrices. What you do is you actually compute its singular value spectrum, and then you cut off at some threshold. So really, you need to be able to kind of look at the whole spectrum. And so this is another natural measure of rank that's sort of more smooth, and you're essentially taking like small powers of your singular values, and then you're dividing by that small power of your largest singular value.
Okay.
So yeah, for different values of alpha, that's the power. And when alpha is 0, you recover your rank. When alpha is 1, you recover this effective rank.
Now that you've mentioned spectral things, I'm
Yeah.
going to jump in. So there is this approach that believe that, in fact, there are most of the interesting action for the algorithm happens in much lower dimension. And this is called effective, summary statistics and effective dynamics.
Okay.
And this has been tried on simple things first, but then more recently on serious tasks like classification with multi-layer deep network, the whole thing. And there you see something which seems very similar to what you're describing here. There is a first region which we call escaping mediocrity, which is the topology is coming, but you don't care. That's the mediocrity. And then at some point, your dynamics concentrate on a much lower dimensional space for this hard problem. And one of the ways so there is a kind of algorithmic Bourbaki type way to describe what these projections should be. But then, more interestingly, when you don't know where they are, the way to find them is spectral. And it's you look either at the Hessian along the trajectory, or what you did with your exactly what you did. You look at all the gradients along the trajectory, and then you take the singular values of this large matrix, and you see that the spectrum is made of a big bulk and a few outliers, which in random matrix is well known, and that's called the BBP transition. And then if you keep these, but interestingly, this is in fact non-monotone. That is, along the trajectory, you may see some 15 modes come out. I mean, this lower dimension be 15, whatever, I make that number up. And then it could be 12, and then it could be... It's only when when the time is much longer, then this stabilizes in a direction that is really meaningful. And then, of course, the dynamics is in this projected space, which is much smaller.
Cool.
Right? So this is pretty similar to what you're... And in fact, uses the same... Once you mentioned spectral, and I had to jump in.
Okay, awesome. Well, I would love to talk to you about that.
That's easy.
Thank you.
Other questions? This one.
I have one completely naive and off-the-wall question. I've always wondered, why do you restrict affine linear functions in your... What if you take polynomials? Does it just become too many variables to keep track of? Is it inefficient? Is there no extra knowledge using polynomials or Fourier coefficients or whatever you want?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I think it's just where these function classes came from. I mean, somehow they developed from... I mean, linear functions are so much nicer than any other kind of function. There are people that are studying, for example, there are like applied algebraic geometers that are studying these networks with polynomial activation functions because it makes it easier to do the mathematics that they know how to do. And I think maybe that's the fairest answer to your question, is that we use linear functions because they're the sort of, we have a handle on them. I mean, linear algebra is so much easier than any other kind of algebra. So why not take those functions and then just add something to it that makes it more interesting, but still keeps a lot of the...
Is it possible to reproduce, say, something with polynomial effects just with a much larger collection of affine linear effects? After all, it's just some finite collection of coefficients that you're using, and then you can turn them into bigger linear.
Yeah. I don't know.
Should not be something piecewise linear.
That's a good point.
Wait, say it again?
One theorem was stating that using linear function and cut off, you just get piecewise linear function.
Right.
Definitely not get that for modulus.
Right, so that proves you get something different. You get more. I mean, what
Yeah.
do you think of polynomials so when you start talking about topology? If I want interesting topology, I take polynomial functions.
Yeah. True.
Okay. So it's now our lunchtime, and all of the attendees are invited to lunch in MUD 407. And if you don't know where that is, I don't either. But it's right next door, and we'll walk over as a group, and someone will find our way. Let's thank Ellie again.